In my last video, I talked a little bit about readable mechanics, and in there, I think I actually did do my full HP rant. But I want to expand upon this and talk very much as a follow-up to that about reason versus rationalization and how that applies to RPG mechanics. And specifically, I want to talk about the difference between this mechanic exists for a reason, as in it represents something or it does a specific thing, versus I have this RPG that I already like. Let me come up with a rationalization after the fact about how this could make sense. Because I think that happens a lot, and I think HP is a really good example for that. Frankly, and we might get into a little bit of HP defense actually, but generally speaking, once HP starts to bloat, it doesn't feel very natural. It doesn't make a lot of sense. If you've got a couple of very high-level fighters hitting each other in the face with a mace, they're just doing such a small percentage of their total health damage to each other, and it doesn't make a lot of sense when you translate that from mechanics into fiction. But a lot of people try to do that. And one of the relatively common ways that I see this happen is people recontextualize HP as not being like meat points. It's not actual physical damage that's being dealt to a character, and instead it's some sort of whittling down of battlefield awareness or sharp senses or endurance or some combination of all of the above. The idea being like, I'm not actually hitting you, but you like had to dodge out of the way at the very last moment, so I'm still wearing you down even though I didn't make contact with you. And that's just not what the mechanic represents. This is, to put it bluntly, cope. When you actually look at how the mechanic interacts with all the other systems and how like different weapons are designed, it's very clear that damage is supposed to be physical damage being imparted on things. And so, to reiterate the examples I gave last time, how weapons are assigned damage, what weapons are high damage weapons versus low damage weapons, doesn't really line up with this idea of how difficult a weapon is to dodge or how much pressure it puts on you. In fact, I would argue that often it's exactly the opposite, especially if we're going off of fantasy logic. When you see like fantasy giant warhammer or giant war axe, you think, and again, granted, this might not be strictly realistic, but generally speaking, the fantasy that they appeal to is like big, wind-up, massive damage kind of attack. The problem is that if you're doing big, slow wind-up for massive damage, massive physical damage, this is a very easy type of attack to dodge compared to a nimbler weapon like a rapier or even a dagger, for example. So if it's supposed to be, whittling down your situational awareness or your endurance, surely it's more of the, to a degree, the finesse weapons, but the small and quick weapons surely should be doing more damage or should make you lose more HP if the HP is like situational awareness or something like that. But that's not how it works. Another couple of ways that we know that HP actually is a physical damage indicator is things like Paladin's Divine Smite. How does Divine Smite make sense unless it is you making contact with the enemy and then channeling divine energies through the weapon into them? I mean, why would it be that I swing my sword as a paladin and I channel some divine energy through it, but it makes you, that's harder to dodge. I guess, is it supposed to be like it's an AoE thing? Like a very miniature AoE that makes it harder to dodge in that sense? And of course, then you have to ask the question about like, how come every attack doesn't cause like even a little bit of like chip damage per se? Am I really supposed to? You almost get like the opposite fantasy problem where it's like, okay, if I roll to miss in this system, even though even though the attack that did damage didn't actually hit, the weapon that would have hit, that causes no issues. I guess I swung my sword so badly that they were so easily able to get out of the way that it took literally no effort. But the other time that I did almost hit them, they had to use so much effort that it did cost them something. There's something there, but it's very sketchy, I would think. And again, once you add in like, how does the divine smite make it harder to dodge? Can I not do it on a miss or something like that? Like what am I supposed to be picturing in my head here? And another one that I didn't mention last time, but structures have HP in D&D. I don't think that's a good design decision myself for various reasons, but they have HP. You can deal damage to objects in D&D if your DM bothers to do that. And so like in ship combat rules, for example, they have HP. Am I supposed to imagine that like a ship's mast is somehow dodging out of the way of a ballista shot? No. It's supposed to be physical damage that is incoming. That's why there's damage types, which, speaking of, if you have resistance to damage types, what does that mean if not you are actually getting hit and then reducing the amount of damage taken to you? So this idea that HP is somehow actually some sort of like stamina bar or something is just wrong. I agree that would make more sense and be a better setup to make a coherent fictional system, but that's not how D&D is designed. There are systems that try to do that, and I mentioned last time, like the Star Trek Adventures stress system supposedly is that, but I have my critiques of that as well, and why I think it also fails at that. And basically the short answer is it's got the same problem of damage types, that they don't really make sense for how the game supposedly works. Like how a disruptor is supposed to do more damage than a standard phaser. But disruptors in Star Trek, unless I'm very mistaken, are not known to be more accurate. They usually are the bad guy weapon, and so it kind of makes sense if you're designing a game to be like, they do more damage because they're nastier, and the bad guys use the nasty weapon. But they don't. But if you're saying like it's how much effort to dodge out of the way, that suddenly doesn't make sense. And I think that's just I think part of that is a change from how Star Trek Adventures first edition and second edition worked, and it was kind of a holdover. Whereas first edition was really messy about what stress actually meant, and I can't go into it now, but it was not good. Star Trek Adventures second edition cleaned it up substantially, but it kept some holdover design from first edition. Second edition doesn't have damage rolls, for example, but they kind of kept the idea that like a disruptor does more default damage, which doesn't make a lot of sense in that thing. But my point is, you could design a system that had like the stamina bar approach, and I would thumbs up that approach. I just don't think many systems do, and those that do that I've seen, which hasn't been many, don't do it particularly well. However, this is a classic example of, I said cope earlier, but the more kind sounding term for it is rationalization. In other words, you're taking something that already exists and then after the fact trying to make it fit or come up with some sort of justification for it. And I think this happens basically for most all mechanics that stem particularly from old school D&D. And this is another video at some point that I'm going to do, is that I really don't like D&D. And when I say that, I don't mean 5th edition specifically. I mean, I don't like pretty much all of the core mechanics of D&D. Anything, basically, if it is above the general principle, if it's above the general principle of a TTRPG, but below like uber specific mechanics, if it's just anything above like generally what would be called as universal tabletop RPG mechanics, role playing and like the concept of rolling dice, anything more specific than that D&D does, basically I don't like it. And I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. I don't like, well, this is not the video for that. But so, like, some of the attributes, for example, is something that I'm not a big fan of, and that's another example of, I think, a case where rationalization happens more than reasoning about the mechanics. Like, why is wisdom... Oh, we lost some light. Wisdom as an attribute is, I think, one of those that doesn't actually make sense as it's applied. In other words, if you try to clear your mind of all of your experience with D&D for a moment, of role-playing games in general, and if you're going to design an attribute, and let's say we'll do it from both ways. The first one is, I tell you I'm going to have a core mechanic in my game and it's going to be called wisdom. What does wisdom mean to you? Again, try to ignore all of your context with D&D and just define wisdom like a regular person. Do you think of their ability to notice things? Probably not particularly. How about their ability to survive in the wilderness? It's maybe. To apply medicine? If I said intelligence or wisdom, which do you associate more with healing and medical knowledge? Would you not say intelligence? Hopefully I'm not getting this wrong, and medicine is an intelligence skill. I try not to think about D&D too much, and here I am talking about it. But my point is that what wisdom functionally does in D&D versus what the word means in common parlance have almost nothing to do with each other. And if, on the other hand, I said I was going to do it the other way, so let's flip it on its head, and I said, I want you to give me a word that describes your ability to have willpower, that's something I forgot, have willpower, perceive things better, survive in the wilderness more effectively, and heal people. I think you'd kind of just look at me and go, there is no one thing that connects those. That's pretty ridiculous. But people always come up with these like rationalizations after the fact, and they say like, oh, intelligence is like book smarts and wisdom is like practical applied knowledge. It's like noticing things, perception is applied knowledge, you're telling me. My ability to withstand, like to have enough willpower to withstand something, that's my knowledge in practice? That's my street smarts? This is a rationalization. What actually happened, and I'm not a D&D historian, but basically, as far as I can tell, wisdom probably was like originally like just the spell casting or a spell casting attribute. And then later when they started expanding skills and they didn't fit into everything else, it's just, stick it in wisdom. That's a wisdom thing. Stick it in wisdom because we got to have the 6 attributes. God forbid we not have the 6 attributes. So again, this is an example of we like the game as it is. We know the 6 attributes. We're fond of the 6 attributes. We got to have the 6 attributes. And I argue that if you were designing from scratch with it's hard to say without, I'm not trying to call like the original creators of D&D stupid, is what I'm trying to get across. When you're creating something out of the ether, you're going to make some decisions that when we have, decades of retrospect that seem weird now. So it's hard to say, like, if you were in a vacuum, you wouldn't come up with these 6 attributes. Like, you might, but I want you to simultaneously look at this as if you still have all of the knowledge or the game design sensibilities of a modern day person, but somehow none of the knowledge of D&D, and that's kind of a silly task to ask. But if you can do that, I am suggesting that you wouldn't come up with the 6 attributes. That the 6 attributes, you might come up with a fair number that overlap. I wouldn't be surprised if you had something like charisma, like intelligence, like strength, like dexterity. I'd be mildly surprised whether or not Constitution made it, to be honest with you. I think that one might be an odd one to come forward. But possibly. I think wisdom is just a weird one to include in there. I'm going to pick on wisdom specifically. But That's part of the game. It's part of the game's identity. We're used to it. So there must be a reason for it. So we come up with a reason after the fact and say, of course it makes sense to have these 6 attributes. Not really. Dexterity is another one where we lump a bunch of stuff into it, but is really like full body coordination and agility the same skill set or the same attribute as like tiny specific manual dexterity? Or is it that it was more convenient for common builds to shove them under the same label? Is the basic skill that I use to shoot a bow and arrow more accurately the same set that would allow me to lockpick or pickpocket? I don't think it is. And that's fine, by the way. It's not necessarily bad that you shove these things under the same attribute. And that's another idea for a video, is how do you pick the attributes that you want for your game? But I just want to point out that I don't think you can say, like, this is out of nothing, you would naturally come to this decision point. At some point, we are backwards rationalizing this, or the reason isn't that they are the most natural choice. Because with dexterity, for example, I'll give you a preview of this argumentation, though I don't want to spend too much time fleshing it out, is that I think attributes have more to do, your selection of attributes as a game designer have more to do, they say more about what archetypical characters you want than being an accurate reflection of human capabilities. In other words, for something like D&D, having the 3 physical attributes of strength, dexterity, constitution is a pretty good idea, because that tells you 3 very different types of characters, or at least 3 different points of emphasis that you can have on the characters. Constitution is the guy that's hard to kill, but may or may not actually do much actively, so to speak. It's very rare that you would see a character like that in D&D, because most people like doing things. But you could, if you had like just a really high constitution and somehow like nothing else, basically you're taking hits and not much else. But your ability to take hits is something interesting to modulate. Strength, obviously, is much more of the straightforward melee damage dealing, and then when you have something like dexterity, that's kind of becomes the catch-all for the nimble character. And what else do we want the nimble character to be? Well, to keep up with the strong and tough characters and the strong and hardy characters, we're going to have the nimble character also be like quick and hard to hit, and ooh, maybe they can sneak too, and then sneaky people, they do the lock picking and stuff. So dexterity to me is more about creating an archetype than necessarily a cogent attribute as such, if that makes any sense. Like it doesn't describe necessarily a single real property that human beings possess, but we don't need to get that fine detailed in the role-playing games. It's just that we want to lump all those things together because that's the archetype. That's the type of that's the type of character that it could represent. Interestingly enough, in Star Trek Adventures, though this is more akin to skills than attributes because they do have attributes, but the departments, which are, again, kind of like skills, are actually named after, or I'm sorry, they call them disciplines when it's a character, and they're departments when it's on a ship, though they have exactly the same names because it is command, con, science, medicine, security, and what was the engineering. So those are literally like character attributes, and so the way I described it to my players is like, when you put points into those disciplines, kind of think of it like a class. Like I am putting levels into a command character, so you kind of get whatever a command officer would do when you put it in there. So, because Star Trek Adventures is very flexible. If you can't tell, I'm running a Star Trek Adventures campaign at the moment. But that's kind of a very in-practice idea of what I'm saying about both skills and attributes, but usually it's more manifest in attributes. Like you're kind of defining the archetypes that could be out there. So yeah, it's not. So, and the reason I think this is important, I guess let's go to that, is the reason that it's important to realize this is you can justify anything. There could be an alternate universe where someone's strength was the main, there was no charisma attribute, and instead all social aspects were based on your strength. And you and I would think about that now and go, that sounds perfectly absurd. But I guarantee you, if that was the game that came out in the 70s, there would be people today going, actually, it makes perfect sense, because you see, strength tends to coordinate with physical fitness. You know, it is a representation of your physical fitness. And physically fit people tend to be more attractive than other people. And also, a stronger person is going to take up more social space, so to speak. They'll leave a bigger impression upon the room. So actually, it makes perfect sense to have strength be your main social attribute, because it'll represent like how imposing you are and also how attractive you are, which are two very important factors to how seriously you're taken. And after all, one of the most common things that we do in D&D in terms of social stuff is intimidation. So of course our main social skill is going to be all about, I'm just going to leave it off, all about intimidation, which makes more sense to be strength than anything else. People would argue that, and it sounds silly to us, but I'm going to say that that's, now granted, a fairly ridiculous example, but some of the arguments that, or some of the arguments that people will put forward today about why things are the way they are, I would submit to you are only slightly less absurd than that is. And I want to challenge people to break out of just, oh, this is the way it is, it must be that way for a reason, and actually ask yourself, what might it look like if it's different? And I would humbly suggest that a lot of the mechanics that we're most familiar with probably wouldn't be used if we started from that approach. Hey, Editing Evan here, and I just wanted to add that I think another reason that people might tend towards this rationalization is because they're not coming at it from a design perspective, like the way that I am trying to, but instead from more of just a simple player's perspective. Like, hey, this is the game that I have. I am, quote-unquote, stuck with it. They're not, but people tend to stick with a single game. And so instead of going like, hey, let's look under the hood and see if we can fix it, instead it's like, how can I slap on an explanation balm to my brain so that I can just keep playing the thing that I know? So, wanted to throw that in there too. Now, that's not to say all of the mechanics are silly and should just be done away with. Some of them do exist for very useful reasons. And here I'll do my minor in defense of HP spiel, which is, put simply, HP does do a useful job. I contend that the worst part of HP is the bloat, not the mechanic itself. Now, I know there are people out there that tend to really prefer, like, wound systems. And I understand that because it does have a lot more weight in terms of, like, storytelling. It describes a specific and discrete event. And generally speaking, that sounds pretty good. But it's also very highly genre dependent. And it also tends to lead towards death spirals unless you're very careful about how you implement your wound system. It doesn't necessarily have to lead to a death spiral, but any sort of wound tends to make you less effective. And the less effective you are, the harder things are going to be for you. And pretty much in any game system, at least that I've seen, the greatest defense is a good offense. Pretty much because if you remove an enemy character from the board, they can't hurt you. So, if you reduce, like, even if you've got the exact same defensive capabilities when you take a wound, if they reduce your offensive capabilities, or really any of your capabilities, that means you're less likely to take an enemy off the board, and if you're less likely to take an enemy off the board, well, you're in a worse position. So, any wound you take makes it easier to facilitate your death, effectively. And if you want more of a, pulpy is probably not the right word, maybe you use the word heroic. These are all very buzzwords nowadays. But if you want to have a combat system where you just want to have the fun of slugging it out with a few people and last a couple of rounds there, and it not to feel punishing, if you're not running like a gritty game or like a horror game or something like that, HP is probably a pretty good way to do that. You've got a number so that you can, like, describe how effective a given blow is. Like, one blow is only going to do a couple of points of damage. That's nothing. But then you get the blow that takes like 15 points of damage, and you're like, oh my god, that guy's so strong. And that's a fun moment at the table to have that. But it won't diminish your capabilities. That can be useful as long as, again, it's not super strained. And this kind of idea of like tone and genre for mechanics applies to pretty much everything that I've discussed now, where even if something doesn't make literal, we're not trying to literally recreate the world with an RPG system. And I suspect that some people get that idea in their head, that like, and maybe I'm just projecting because I've had that idea in the past, and I had to really come to terms with, this is not a good idea to do something like strictly realistic, because realism is a difficult conversation to have because it's much more complicated than you might realize. But because then you have to deal with people's intuitions and whether or not they actually understand what's reality or not. And actually knowing what's reality or not is very difficult. People have intuitions about how things are realistic, and often it's not. To give the quick example here, if I show you two films, and one of them is washed out colors, and it's very violent, and you see someone get shot, it's a war film, and someone gets shot, and their guts explode out, and people are swearing constantly, and dragging the person to the medical, but they're already dead, there's nothing we can do for them. Versus, I show you another one that has kind of bright, vivid colors as someone's walking around a store, and then it's a normal day, very boring, mundane conversation. All of a sudden, someone, there's a couple of gunshots, but you don't see much. The guy's talking. It ends very quickly. It's very quick. It's abrupt. People are talking normally. One guy sits down, and he never gets up again, and someone has like a goofy, strange reaction to something, and the dialogue is slightly off-putting and comedic. It's like, which one of these is realistic? And it's like, well, the washed out, shaky cam, grainy video, that's obviously the realistic one. And it's like, nah, actually, kind of played up a little bit. Like, there actually is color in the real world. Like, this is artificial. The amount of blood and guts spilling out is also more than what you'd expect. Whereas the other one, where it's like the violence is like super quick and kind of understated, and the people don't die right away, and kind of anticlimactically, and people say weird and funny things and have unusual reactions to stuff. It's like, that's actually what reality looks like. It's happening in like I want to shake some filmmakers and be like, do you have eyes, actually? When I look outside, there is color. Where did this idea of realism means desaturated colors come from? And yet every time, like, we want to have like a gritty, realistic thing, it's like, you're not showing me reality. You're showing me some weird stylized thing, and for some reason we've accepted that this stylization is actually real. I don't know, maybe that's a dead trend now, and if it is, thank God. So what is realistic also in terms of like physics? Don't get me started. So the goal, what I'm trying to say, long tangent to get back to RPGs, the idea that I'm trying to get to is, when you're designing an RPG, your goal shouldn't necessarily be strict realism, should be readability, see last video, but you are selectively tuning how realistic your thing is based on the genre that you want. And so the other thing, too, why some people might be defensive of certain mechanics or take them for granted, that's probably a better way to say it, is to take it for granted, is they're used to thinking in very specific genre terms. And so when you think in one genre, certain mechanics just seem natural and right, and it's like, they are. But that doesn't mean the mechanic itself is realistic or suitable for all other genres, and we should just like port it into others. I should have thought of a good example before I started that spiel, but I don't have one. I'm sorry. Well, I kind of do. I kind of mentioned it with like HP. It's like, maybe if you have like more of a horror game, maybe you should use a wound system so that the violence isn't just, fun and funny. It actually has, I shouldn't say funny, fun and exciting, so that the damage actually has lasting consequences and is scary, and you don't want to take damage. And maybe, actually, here's a good way to put it. Maybe you have a lot fewer combat mechanics in your horror game. Now, of course, if it's action horror, that's a different story. But if it's more of, if you really want to have a horror game where the goal is don't fight, and I think I'm cribbing from my last video again, like, maybe simplify the mechanics and have, like, the consequences of a failed roll be, like, a lot more dire. You don't actually have to do the whole roll for initiative. You've got a move action and a standard action and a reaction. No, you can just be like, the monster steps into the room. What do? Run, hide, or fight. And if you choose fight, by the way, and you fail the roll, you are going to suffer a wound, and that wound is going to suck a lot. And that's how we roll. That's how this combat system works. It's not much of a system because you're not supposed to fight. But again, it's kind of taken for granted that, like, oh, it's combat. We got to have combat rules. The combat rules have to be half the book. No, they don't. It's again kind of a rationalization, and I'll probably repeat that several times in future videos. So, takeaway, hopefully, from this video is challenge your assumptions about whether or not a mechanic should be in an RPG. Should a mechanic exist? Does it make sense that this mechanic exists from the drawing board? Go back to the drawing board. Would you, based on the goals of your RPG, should this mechanic exist? Don't try and after the fact say, oh, I'm used to this mechanic, or I like this mechanic. Here's how it could make sense. And the difference between that, the reason for having the mechanic, and a rationalization for having a mechanic is sometimes difficult to parse out. But I think if you try and engage with finding that distinction, it can at least open up your thinking. So that's what I got for today. Thanks for watching.